The idea of stopping Iran's nuclear program is the pretext. What these people want is a change in the regime in Iran. These are the people who have led the United States into the most disastrous foreign policy debacles, the most destructive wars based on lies for decades.
So Glenn Greenwald recently had a podcast where he talks about the Trump administration's recent attempts to deal with Iran directly to limit their nuclear weapons program. And what he gets into here is interesting because he talks a little bit about why some of the leading neocons are so against this deal, despite the fact that it directly addresses what they purport to care about, and that's limiting Iran's capacity to strike with the nuclear weapons. So let's watch and let's react.
One of the things that you realize for the first time if you live outside the United States is just how aberrational it is for a country to constantly spend its time talking about which country it ought to go to war with next. It's usually unheard of for most countries to even consider the possibility of a war with another country or bombing other countries or attacking other countries, let alone to actually do so. And in the United States, we have an endless array, a really literally endless array of military conflicts, bombing campaigns, wars, invasions, and all kind of covert actions in other countries as well. And it seems always like the public grows increasingly tired of that. Poll after poll constantly demonstrates that people are eager for an end to endless war, that these wars are not in the interest of American citizens or American interests. Candidates who run on a platform of being anti-war, of avoiding war, as Barack Obama did, as Donald Trump did, tend to do extremely well because they're telling the American people what they already want and believe, which is that these wars are being fought in a way that not only doesn't benefit their lives, but in so many ways undermines and subverts and prejudices it.
Isn't it so crazy, too, that the default in the context of the American political system, at least in modern times, is not whether or not to bomb countries around the world. That's not the default. That's not the orthodox Overton window. What it is which country should the U.S. bomb next, like Glenn is talking about here. This is crazy. And even after the neocons are purported to have lost so much power or, fled to losing ranks of the Democratic Party, like Bill Kristol and others that just loathe Trump, they still seem to maintain an incredible amount of influence regardless of presidential administration, either as part of the deep state or as part of the current administration. You have Mike Waltz and Rubio and Huckabee and Stefanik and John Ratcliffe and a lot of pro-neocon, pro-Zionist people.
The war in Iraq is something that should have put an end to this forever. It was the supreme expression of a war begun and sold based on falsehoods and lies, not just about the cause of the war, but also how the war would end up being prosecuted. We were told, it'd be over in a few weeks. We're so much more powerful than Iraq. We're just going to remove the Saddam Hussein regime. We're going to be welcomed as liberators. It's going to be quick in and quick out. And then we're going to have freedom and democracy spreading throughout the Middle East. Absolutely none of that happened. All the people who told us those things, which ended up disproven and debunked, didn't lose any stature at all in Washington. If anything, they gained it and are more powerful than ever. And that's why, basically 20 years later, the same people are back and have been back for the last 20 years, selling similar wars of regime change in Syria and Libya and getting us involved in all sorts of conflicts all around the world. Obama bombed 8 Muslim majority countries, killing all sorts of civilians, generating anti-American hatred and instability.
It's a revolving door. You have Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Tom Cotton. And on the left, you have Chuck Schumer. And the neocon influence and rabid pro-war influence in the government is pervasive. It doesn't know a singular party. It's the uniparty, as Glenn is talking about. And he's so right. The indictment against the war in Iraq couldn't be stronger over the failings of that thing. And nonetheless, you still have the same blueprint being applied all across the world. Right now, a lot of people are focusing toward Iran in that regard.
Fought in Afghanistan for 20 years. As soon as we left, the Taliban marched right back into power as though nothing had ever happened. Iraq went from whatever else you think of Saddam Hussein, an actual adversary of Iran, to basically being a proxy state of Iran, strengthening Iran, the country we were told is the greatest terrorist regime on the planet. None of what we were told was going to happen actually happened, and that's true for essentially every single one of these conflicts. And yet every time there's an attempt to sell the US and American citizens into participating in or funding a new war, as we're doing, funding the Israeli destruction of Gaza, as we're funding the Ukraine war with Russia, the propaganda is very intense. All you have to do is keep people's fear level high enough for a certain period of time to get them to sign on, or emotionally manipulate them enough to get them to sign on. And once they do, even if a few months later or a year later they start regretting it, the war just continues without any end in sight. And the current target, clearly, openly, if you pay attention to the news at all, you would know, is a new war with Iran. It's being sold just like the war in Iraq, in the sense that, oh, this is a very limited war, don't worry. It's not going to be a full-on, years-long war. It's going to go bomb a few of their nuclear reactors.
We'll be greeted as liberators. Who remembers that one? Let me know in the comments if you remember that one.
Or Israel's going to do it, and we're going to help them. And all the fear-mongering, oh, Saddam Hussein was on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. He's going to hand it to Osama bin Laden, who will use it to smuggle nuclear weapons into the United States. Same exact narrative.
I'm laughing in sadness, actually, because I remember all this stuff like it was yesterday. And I hate to say, in the original bombing campaign and the first steps of the war in Iraq, I was a supporter. I was a neocon, and I am dead embarrassed about it now because I was repeating some of the same propaganda, all drummed up by the neocons and the CIA, all for nothing.
Iran is just seconds away from getting a nuclear bomb. We can't allow them to do so. It would be the end of all of history. Everyone in the world would die. You're going to die if Iran gets a nuclear weapon or is allowed to get close. And therefore, we have to go to war. And it's coming from the same people who have been debunked and exposed as liars over and over, because in Washington, there's an accountability-free zone for people who advocate wars. In fact, they get more and more powerful both within media and politics. It really doesn't make a difference what happened in the past. They're able to use the same tactics over and over. Now, the difference is that Donald Trump ran in 2016 on trying to break that bipartisan war policy of endless war. He ran not only against the Democratic Party, but the Bush-Cheney regime. He had to do so. Jeb Bush was his primary opponent, backed by the entire Republican establishment and all of the moneyed interests that support the Bush family and the Republican Party. And Trump prided himself and often boasted about the fact that he was he was the only president in decades not to involve the U.S. in a new war. And all of this leads to this very strange undermining of Pete Hegseth, who, as all reporting has suggested, my own conversations also confirm, is absolutely with J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff on the side of restraint. And Hegseth has been a target of establishment forces in Washington from the time that he was nominated. Trump used a lot of capital to get him into that position.
Yeah, as far as Pete Hegseth goes, they say that Trump really liked watching him on Fox News for whatever reason, but he has not had the qualifications of many secretaries of defense. Now, I'm not saying that it's good to follow the patterns of previous secretaries of defense, mostly because many of those were pro-war kind of neocon types. But it doesn't seem like he has the qualifications that a lot of his predecessors did. But this restraint thing is kind of interesting because it's hard to know exactly what to believe here, because he was a total hawk when it came to bombing Yemen. And Iran is a different country. But in the correspondence that was leaked from Signal, he said one of the ways that we can sell this bombing is to blame Iran. So maybe this is a different kind of approach to Iran when it comes to bombing it, as opposed to just blaming, U.S. bombing in Yemen on Iran. But I hope that's right. I hope he does want restraint. And something makes me think he does, in a way, because of some of his subordinates being dismissed in recent days, like Dan Caldwell, who was just on the Tucker Carlson show talking about what happened there. And the official excuse is he got fired for leaking information, but he swears he did not. But if you want to watch that, I really recommend doing it. He is a non-interventionist, essentially. And I think it's no mystery why he got ejected from the Trump regime is because of that fact. Now, he talks about how Trump also more or less ended the dynasties of Bush and Clinton in many ways. And that might be Trump's best accomplishment, not being president. Just doing those two things is a great thing. But there's been so many different, escalations that he has done as president. In his first term, he escalated the war in Yemen and in Syria. And he used one of his sole presidential vetoes to extend the war in Yemen when he got a bill on his desk that would have completely ended it. So I won't say that he's as bad in terms of foreign policy as many of his predecessors. Certainly not Bush, certainly not Obama, and he's not as bad as Biden on that regard. But still, it's worth considering.
Not because he's some sort of foreign policy dissenter. He has not been in the past. Quite the opposite. But his loyalty now is to Trump, and he has been siding with the America First foreign policy for the most part. He was obviously a big advocate of bombing Yemen, and I have a lot of opposition to that. But when it comes to Iran, he has been perceived as an impediment, and the people closest to him are now being targeted, and the Wall Street Journal, always the voice of the GOP establishment, not just when it comes to economic policy and neoliberalism, but also to GOP militarism, is very excited by exploiting the Pete Hegseth problem in order to do the following. This is their editorial from today called the Hegseth Pentagon Chronicles. Quote, no doubt the Beltway press would love to knock Pete Hegseth out as defense secretary, but that doesn't come close to explaining the mess at the Pentagon. The staff infighting, dismissals, and leaks over Signal app chats look to be a self-inflicted mistake of a management neophyte. If Mr. Hegseth is wise, here's what the Wall Street Journal says he should do. He'll use the staff shakeup to hire some loyal grown-ups who know the building instead of self-promoting isolationists he brought in. Look at that formulation. Hegseth hired a bunch of people who are become extremely skeptical of U.S. foreign policy, especially the idea of endless war in the Middle East, of war with Iran. And the Wall Street Journal is saying, look, we've stripped you of all your advisors. Now is the time to get ordinary establishment militarists surrounding you, as opposed to these war skeptics that you hired to be your closest advisors that are now gone.
Yeah, that's the way to placate the neocons and the foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex. Just get neocons into the regime. Get neocons into the administration, and we can all move on. Otherwise, you have seen this kind of slow crawl toward trying to get Hegseth to resign. Now, there was a story that came out just a few days ago that purported he had leaked information about the Yemen strike to another signal group that included family members, but it's not really clear to me who is the source of that or whether that's true or not. I'm still following that story and hope more comes to light. But Glenn is right. This is comical. We all know the game here, and it's all angling for more pro-war officials in the administration.
One of the people who was Hegseth's closest advisor, who was the target in kind of the fallout of this firing, he was escorted out of the office last week under very strange circumstances, is Dan Caldwell, a former Marine who has fought in wars and has that sort of skepticism about these wars from having fought in them that I've seen in many other people like him. Tulsi Gabbard has similar skepticism about regime change wars after having gone and fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Lots of other people like that as well. And Dan Caldwell was interviewed today on by Tucker Carlson. It's a 90-minute discussion. You can find it on Tucker's show. It is about the dangers of U.S. military conflict with Iran, the multifaceted dangers, the bipartisan and multi-level pressures being applied to the Trump administration to pursue a war with Iran, notwithstanding the fact that there are no American interests there. And Dan Caldwell has an excellent grasp on the history of U.S. foreign policy. He's a young guy. He is not part of this kind of Republican militarism machine. He talks about how there's been this very clear breakdown in left versus right when it comes to militarism and interventionism. You find a lot of opposition to a war with Iran on the left and also the populist right. And those are the people who are being systematically targeted now within the Trump administration. hoping to amplify the voices of people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and these other traditional neocons that populate the Trump administration. And I cannot recommend enough listening to Dan Caldwell speak to Tucker for 90 minutes about what he thinks, what he learned from his short time in the Pentagon, but also the broader experiences and foreign policy theories that have led him to this skepticism that has made him a threat to a lot of people in Washington. Now, I just want to conclude, because I want to bring on Lee Fung in just a second. One of the points Dan Caldwell made is that Trump absolutely is committed to the diplomatic resolution. He does not want to cast aside the possibility of diplomacy in pursuit of war, even though people like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham, all the usual suspects, Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, are encouraging that. He's saying, I think we can do a deal that will result in assurances that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. And a lot of the hardest core neocons, the most fanatical Israel loyalists, are going insane because the idea of stopping Iran's nuclear program is the pretext. What these people want is a change in the regime in Iran. They want to go back to installing the Shah of Iran's monarchy that they installed back in 1954.
This is so true. Glenn is a genius here. This is the exact reason that the neocons hate this idea of a new negotiation with Iran. And he's so right. The only thing that he gets wrong here is that Iran coup took place in 1953 and not 1954. But Glenn's totally right here. This would take the pretext off the table that the neocons have right now in their belt as a tool right now to promote regime change in Iran. It's the same thing that Netanyahu referenced when he said he wanted the Libya model for Iran. Well, what was that? That was a US and NATO-led coup of the Libyan government to take out Muammar Gaddafi and replace him with a new regime, which, by the way, consequently has allowed open slave trading, by the way. That is what the neocons want. It's a regime change operation, which we know doesn't work, which we know often results in enemies of the U.S., even after the U.S. funds that either that new regime or the revolutionary force that overthrows the old regime. So Glenn is entirely right here. This is why Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin and some others just despise the idea of even talking to Iran.
And the Shah of Iran's son thinks he's the legitimate ruler of Iran. They want to put him back into office. Dan Caldwell called him the ultimate fail son. You may remember the Iraq War, the exact same strategies. They had a bunch of Iraqi exiles who had no connection to the Iraqi people, who hadn't lived there for 40 years, people like Ahmed Shamaldi, who was going to float in and govern Iraq once they got rid of Saddam as a U.S. puppet, a puppet of neocons, a puppet of Israel, just like the Shah of Iran was. That is still their plan. That is the real goal, to scare Americans about Iran's nuclear program as a pretext for changing the regime of Iran. Here's Mark Dubowitz from one of the most neoconservative think tanks in Washington, giving up the game because he's scared that Trump is going to succeed in diplomacy. He says, quote, "The Islamic Republic is weaker than ever, hated by most Iranians," meaning we're going to be welcomed as liberators, same thing we heard in Iraq, "hammered by the IDF and Mossad. Its terror armies, air defenses, missile production capabilities are in ruins. Never a better time to dismantle its nuke program and finish off the regime. Will another POTUS blink?" Meaning, will Trump be too scared to send Americans to go die for a regime change war in Iran, notwithstanding the utter and complete and total failure of regime change wars in the Middle East over the last 25 years, at least failure from the American perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is so crazy. This is what all the neocons are saying right now, and it's not exactly a stunning revelation that most people in most countries would probably hate their government. I hate my government in the US. And relatively speaking, it might be a better government than many places in the world. I still have problems with it, and that's not good enough for me because I choose liberty over the purported security it offers and all the coercion it's based on. But the truth is that America cannot just go around regime change operation after regime change operation, replacing governments just because of the criteria that citizens in that country hate its government, which I actually don't doubt in some regards in terms of Iran. But that argument stretched to its maximum application just means world empire. It's empire building. It's what the U.S. has done for, more than a half century at this point, and it's never borne fruit. It just gets us into debt. It leads to inflation. It leads to war profiteering, twisted incentive structures where bomb makers profit off the deaths of others. And we all suffer here at home because of losses of civil liberties. We saw that in terms of the Patriot Act, the erection of the surveillance state. We saw that in regard to the creation of the DHS and the TSA and the Patriot Act. It's nonsense.
Not necessarily from the Israeli one. There's also an attack on Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence because she has been giving intelligence to Trump, saying that there's no good intelligence that Iran actually is moving toward a nuclear weapon, which U.S. intelligence has been saying for quite some time.
Despite Netanyahu saying for 2 decades, every 2 or 3 years or so, that Iran is weeks or months away from acquiring a nuke. That's all he ever seems to have said historically over and over in various pieces. And if you don't agree with me on that or are skeptical of that, just Google that and you'll find it.
And there's now an attempt, and this should sound very familiar to anyone who understands the Iraq War, on the part of neocons to target and coerce Tulsi Gabbard into altering the intelligence to say the opposite, that Iran is moving toward nuclear weapons to be able to justify the war. Like Dick Cheney used to go to the CIA, like Paul Wolfowitz had his own stovepiped information from the CIA.
Just think of how crazy that is. If the intelligence doesn't turn out the way you want it to support your campaign for Iranian regime change, well, just change the intelligence. It really just reveals and drops the mask of how business as usual in Washington is run, where if the result isn't what you want to support your campaign, your crusade for war, hey, just change the intelligence. Just lie to the American people. Bring us back to Dick Cheney days, those good old days in the run up to the war in Iraq. That's basically what they're trying to do right now.
Lots of people in the CIA were saying there's no evidence Saddam had nuclear weapons, let alone biological and chemical weapons, and they went there and insisted and pressured intelligence officials to give the intelligence they wanted, that Colin Powell then destroyed his reputation by going to the UN to presenting, to justify the war. That's exactly what's happening here. Here from the journal American Greatness. DNI Gabbard must reverse, quote, stupid U.S. intelligence on Iran's nuclear weapons program. U.S. intelligence still claims Iran has no active nuclear weapons program, despite stockpiles of near weapons-grade uranium and evidence of covert weaponization efforts. So they're saying the U.S. intelligence community, Tulsi Gabbard, have to change the intelligence from what they have, which is that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons actively, to say that they are, so that we can have a regime change war against Iran. Here is neocon Mark Levin, who cited this article today, said, very important, please read to the end. Red flags are everywhere. Can't say we've not been warned. What's going on here is as dangerous as it is manifest. These are the people who have led the United States into the most disastrous foreign policy debacles, the most destructive wars based on lies for decades. You can debate why they have an interest in doing that. But what we know for certain is it is not in the interest of the American people. It doesn't produce prosperity or security for the United States. In fact, the opposite is true. When you go around constantly invading other countries and meddling in other countries, you produce a lot of anti-American sentiment that leads to things like 9/11 attacks and other terrorist attacks, again, by people who are extremely angry that you're bringing violence to their country. It unites all sorts of countries in a coalition, in unison, against the United States, who, as Dan Caldwell pointed out in that great interview he did with Tucker Carlson, ought not to have anything in common. Why should Russia and China and Iran and North Korea be in an alliance against the United States, given their grave differences? It's because we forced them into one.
And that's the most destructive part of U.S. foreign policy, perhaps, is the fact that we've forced these great powers that are now the U.S. enemies into kind of their own military alliances. That kind of is what BRICS is building right now. We've built, essentially, because of U.S. action and NATO action, a Sino-Russo alliance, and that is a bad prospect for the United States. We have, on one hand, one of the greatest nuclear powers on Earth that has the biggest nuclear weapon stockpile in Russia, and a rising giant in China, both now adversarial against the U.S. in many ways because of U.S. foreign policy. And that didn't have to happen. And there's many things that I despise about Richard Nixon, but one of the best things he did in terms of foreign policy was help drive a total wedge between the Soviet Union and China by opening up diplomatic and trade relations with China. And I don't know if that's possible now. It's really sad.
We're turning the world against us with all of these constant wars that are in the interest of some people, the people demanding it, but certainly not in the interest of the citizens of the country who pay for it or who go fight in them. And the pattern should be so immediately recognizable to anyone who understands not distant history, but very recent history.
Yeah, Glenn's right on here. One of my friends, Daniel McAdams, always says that it's not enough just to oppose the war. It's very great to be anti-war, and that's very redeemable. But we have to be against war propaganda, because that's what starts the wars. And you can see right now, that's the phase we're in. These neocons want regime change so bad, and they pretend so much to care about Iran's nuclear weapon program, the uranium enrichment program, so much that they don't want negotiations with Iran to try to limit it, because that takes away the justification to impose a regime change on Iran. So Glenn puts it right here. There's no bigger truth than that the Trump administration is split on this issue because of who Trump chose to populate his administration with. He chose RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, both of which are known for less hawkish foreign policy views in general. They're on Israel, it's different because you had to be a Zionist to get into this administration. But then on the other hand, he also included Mike Waltz and Mike Huckabee and Marco Rubio and John Ratcliffe and warmongers who are essentially Washington insider pro-war shills. So that's why you're seeing a divide here. And on the right-wing neocon side, they're just saying the same things that they've been saying for 25 years, never letting up, unabated propaganda to impose regime change. And we can't accept it. But I do want to hear what you guys have to say about it. So down in the comments below, let me know, do you think we will get through the Trump administration without a military strike on Iran by the United States or by Israel with the assistance of the United States? Let me know in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.